I will do a little bit of small talk while that happens as we bring people in from the Zoom waiting room. And so you'll just hear me kind of patter about for a few minutes before I actually start the program. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Do a little bit of small talk while that happens as we bring people in from the Zoom waiting room. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. If you'll bear with us for just a moment, we're bringing everyone in from the waiting room. It'll take just a moment. So I'll ask you to bear with us as we bring you in. We'll be turning off your microphones, though you're welcome to have your cameras on if you'd like. We just turn off your microphones in order to minimize the background noise during the initial part of the presentation. We do urge you to turn your chat window on, and I'll say some more about that in a moment, since that'll be one way that you can interact with this evening's speaker, as well as the other people that are joining us at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities this evening. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. I'll ask you to bear with us for just 1 or 2 minutes more while we continue to admit people from the waiting room. It's a slightly arduous process, so I appreciate your patience as we bring you all in. It is, of course, a pity that we couldn't be welcoming you to the campus of the University of Tulsa. It's a beautiful place, and we very much miss the opportunity for human interaction and conversation that events like this one bring with them. As a colleague of mine has often said, it's very difficult to run a humanities center without actual humans in the room. And so we're grateful to all of you for joining us this evening and helping us make that happen through these digital tools. All right, I think we're about ready to go. We'll be admitting a few more people here as they come in, but I'm going to go ahead and say a few words of introduction before I turn things over to my colleague, Professor Matthew Drever, who will actually be moderating this evening's discussion. My name is Sean Latham. I'm the Pauline McFarland Walter Professor of English at the University of Tulsa, where I serve as the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, which is the host for this evening's event. Before we get going, I want to say just a few words about the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, about our mission and our activities, and give you some sense of some of our upcoming events as well. So essentially at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, we have two essential missions, the first of which is to act as a think tank here on campus. And to do that work, we bring together faculty, students at the University of Tulsa, and members of the community. And each year that group meets together as part of an intensive research seminar. We secure applications from these from across the region. The competition is relatively fierce for this opportunity to work with colleagues and students, as I said, members from the community, on problems and ideas that we think can only be fully and richly illuminated using the distinctive tools of the arts and humanities. Throughout this academic year, we've been working on two crucial and interlinked themes that we think speak powerfully to the moment: rage on the one hand and courage on the other. When we initially conceived of this as our theme for this year, we had very much had our eye on the centenary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. The 100-year anniversary of that terrible event is approaching later this spring. And we thought very much about the idea of rage going into it and about the courage of the people in that community who not only fought to preserve their lives and their homes and their families and their businesses, but also struggled and succeeded in rebuilding a city that had been decimated by racist violence. As we began to lead into this theme, COVID happened, and it seemed like courage and rage spoke even more powerfully to this moment that finds all of us dealing with a global pandemic and the radical disruptions to our lives and our communities that it has produced. And we've been fortunate throughout the year to host a variety of different events on topics that intersect with these themes. If you were with us 2 weeks ago, you'll know that tonight's event is actually part of essentially a two-part project on immigration that we've been working on this year. 2 weeks ago, we had Mauricio Cordero from MIT, who is here to talk about graphic novels and especially about the role that art can play in building empathy for immigrant communities. And tonight, of course, we'll be joined by Reverend Daniel Grudy, who will be talking to us about immigration from a faith-based perspective. So in addition to this kind of research work that I've described us doing on campus, the other essential piece of our mission is to engage with the community. And as I said, bring the arts and humanities that we practice here on the campus out into the larger community and to bring that larger community onto campus. That's one of the reasons it's a pleasure to welcome you here to this virtual seminar this evening and as I said, I look forward to actually welcoming you to campus next year when we resume in-person programming as well. I do want to say a few words about a few upcoming programs we have at the center. So next week on the 18th of March, we'll be joined by Professor Sarah Ray, who will be giving a talk called Coming of Age at the End of the World, an Existential Toolkit for the Climate and COVID Generation. That will be at 7 p.m. In this same kind of Zoom format that we're using this evening. And on the 25th of March, we'll be joined by Elizabeth Utka, who will be giving a talk titled Zombies, Seances, and the Unrestful Dead, Art After Pandemics. And in particular, she'll be looking in a kind of comparative way at the artistic responses to the pandemic of 1918, the so-called Spanish flu pandemic, and the artistic responses that are emerging to our own pandemic situation. So I hope you'll join us for both of those events later this month. I also want to take a moment. If you've attended OCH events in the past, you'll know that this is an important part of some of the work that we do. I'd like you to take a moment to just open your chat window if you haven't already done so in Zoom. You can do that if you're unfamiliar with Zoom by just hovering your mouse over the window, and you'll see a chat button appear at the bottom. If you just click on that, you'll see a window appear on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you would take a moment and just type into the chat a word of introduction or of hello or welcome, we'd love to have you just say a few words to introduce yourself and bring yourself into this space with us. So even though we operate in these distanced ways, we have a sense of who else is sharing the evening with us. You certainly needn't feel obligated to do this, but we'd welcome the chance for those kinds of introductions. Finally, I want to say a word about the theme at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities next year. So when we turn to 2021-22, the academic year for us, we'll be changing our focus to the theme of recovery and renewal. This obviously speaks, I hope, to what will be the beginning of our post-pandemic era. And very shortly, we'll be putting out our initial call for public fellows. So for those of you who are outside of the University of Tulsa, this gives you an opportunity, as I said at the outset, to come and join with faculty and students on campus and to work on this theme in a really intensive and interesting way. We open applications from all walks of life, all kinds of backgrounds. We think that the humanities work best when they bring together a diverse array of people who can bring expertise of all kinds, not just academic, but practical, business-oriented, and otherwise. So if the theme of renewal and recovery speaks to you, I hope you'll keep an eye on our website and take a moment perhaps to consider applying to the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities for one of our public fellowships next year. And it's those fellows that I have very much in mind, because tonight's event is actually going to be moderated by one of our faculty fellows here at the University of Tulsa. And it's a pleasure, in fact, to welcome Dr. Matthew Drever. He's been leading our seminar on courage throughout this past academic year. And it's really thanks to him that we were able to bring together tonight's event. He is the Rita and William Bell Associate Professor of Anglican and Ecumenical Studies here at the University of Tulsa. And in a sort of feat of daring, I suppose, he chairs the departments of philosophy, religion, and sociology. He's the author of numerous essays and chapters on Augustine and is the author of Image, Identity, and the Forming of the Augustinian Soul. As I said, he's really the one that made tonight's event possible and created the introductions that allowed us to bring Reverend Grudy to Tulsa in this virtual format this evening. And it's been a real pleasure actually to work with him throughout the course of this year at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming him as I turn the program over to Matt. Matt, thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Sean. I suppose I should pause here for the hand clapping, and then it's always the virtual environment is always a strange one to be in. No, thank you, Sean. And thank you to the OCH and Tara and for everybody else who is hosting this event tonight. I want to thank everybody, and also special thanks to Father Grudy for being here. When Sean and I talked at the beginning of this academic year in August about the Courage seminar, I thought of various themes that I wanted us to explore, but one of them that really came to mind for me was the question of immigration and migration, and really how we treat those oftentimes who are the most vulnerable in society, ours and others. And pretty much anywhere you go in the world, immigrants and migrants are oftentimes those who are most vulnerable. And so that was one of the issues that I really hope to explore and to talk about in the theme of courage and how we can treat those and think about that issue. And so tonight I'm very excited to have Father Grudy with us. He is, so for those of you who don't know, Father Grudy is currently the Vice President and Associate Provost for the University of Notre Dame. He also serves as a university fellow and trustee and associate professor of theology and global affairs. And if that's not enough, and it's already probably too much for him, but he's also a Kellogg Institute faculty fellow, former director of the global leadership program within the Institute. He's a Catholic priest in the Holy Religious Order. He's an award-winning professor, author, and film producer. And so it's our pleasure to have him here this evening, to be able to listen to the wealth of experience he brings. He is drawing on multiple years of work on international migration and refugee issues. Father Grudy has authored numerous books and articles that have been translated into over 7 languages. His works include Globalization, Spirituality, and Justice, Navigating the Path to Peace, and Border of Death, Valley of Life, An Immigrant Journey of Heart and Spirit. He's currently completing another book, which he says is almost across the finish line. And so that will add, he will soon have that out. He is also an executive producer of several internationally acclaimed films and documentaries, which is something that academics oftentimes they don't sort of make their way into that array, but it's great to have him into that work in that area as well. And some of his films and documentaries include One Border, One Body, Immigration in the Eucharist, and Dying to Live, A Migrant's Journey. Grudy has also worked with the US Congress, the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, the World Council of Churches, the Vatican, and the United Nations on issues of theology, globalization, migration, and refugees. In 2007-8, he was also a visiting research fellow at Oxford University's Refugee Studies Center. So, Father Grudy, it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the University of Tulsa, and I would now like to turn it over to you. Again, thank you very much for being here this evening.
Great, Matt. Thank you for inviting me. And it's great to be here in Tulsa, albeit virtually. And I have some good friends in Oklahoma and in the Tulsa area. So I'm glad to just share a few moments with you tonight on this issue, which is such an important issue, such a complicated issue, obviously such a controversial issue as well. So I'm going to just try to share my screen here for a second so we can just call this up. And what I'd like to do is just share with you just some reflections today on a different take on migration, and that is to look at it from a faith-based humanitarian vision. So mostly this issue is dominated by political, social, cultural perspectives on migration, but I want to offer somewhat of a different take on it today. But I'd like to begin by just talking a little bit about a story that happened in 2000. Actually, in June of 2000, there was a remarkable discovery that was announced on the front lawn of the White House. And that is Francis Collins, a well-known scientist who was really a pioneer in genetic research, had basically publicly announced that they had deciphered the human genome. And if you were to look at this in perspective, that if you were to take a 12-point font, 8.5 by 11 paper and have a stack of pages as high as the Washington Monument, you would basically say that in all the character details of that stack of paper, they basically were able to decipher sort of the different characters on the human genome. But by also looking at that sequence, they were able to identify certain parts of this. And by comparing this with indigenous communities around the world, they did something remarkable, and that is they were able to trace back our migration heritage. So just with a swab from the inside of the cheek, you can actually look at your migration heritage. And I think this has become more popular in recent years. But I just want to start here by mentioning that this is my family's migration history over the last 80,000 years. And it's believed that we began somewhere in Africa, and that through wars, divisions, fightings, scarcity of foods, environmental calamities, and others, people moved, and they moved through different parts. And the best we can decipher, this is the kind of broad outlines of where my family would have migrated over the last 80,000 years. And they probably ended up somewhere in England, and then the more proximate migration ancestry would have gone from there to Ireland, and then from Ireland over to the United States. So it's striking to see how migration is really literally in our genes. And it's in our spiritual genes as well. Even as we look at the scriptures, after the 12th chapter on, it really begins on a note of migration. And as the spotlight is put on Abraham, the first words we hear are, leave your country, go to the land that I will show you, and you will be a blessing. And so from Abraham to the patriarchs, to Exodus, to exile, to return, to incarnation, to discipleship, to even the vision from the book of Revelation, naming that we're pilgrims and migrants in this world, migration runs through the scriptures from beginning to end. This is actually the journey of Abraham, this red line. But actually, if you look at the contemporary boundaries today, this is the territory that Abraham would have migrated through in his own day, thousands of years ago. And it's really the epicenter of a lot of the migration crisis today. So it's in our spiritual genes, it's in our American genes, it's actually in our contemporary experience as well. So this whole thing of all the conflict going on with migration today, in many ways, it's not a new topic. It's really as old as the scriptures and beyond. But today's reflections, I'd like to really look at one experience in particular, and that is something that happened shortly after Pope Francis was named Pope. He had heard a story of a group of refugees that had left the African coast, and most likely in a boat like this. And you can see they literally, pile in on these boats, especially after the Arab Spring, but even now, and they make their way across the Mediterranean. And what happened is a boat like this capsized, but only 8 people survived. And they survived by clinging to a fishing net in the middle of the ocean. But when the fishermen to whom these nets belonged saw these migrants, instead of saving them, they actually severed their nets and they cast them to die into the ocean depths. And Pope Francis was so moved by this indifference that within 8 days, he made a trip to a small island called Lampedusa, which is off the coast of Italy. It's in between Africa and Italy. He had very little notice. It was his first major trip outside of the Vatican, but it was a remarkable one because it symbolized a lot of what his vision about life and migration and faith is about. And what he did when he got there was he placed a wreath on the side of the waters where these migrants died, but then he celebrated Mass out near the ocean harbor outside. And he actually, they created an altar over a small boat. He used a crozier that is a shepherd's staff that was made in the form of a ship's wave. The pulpit was made from the rudders of the boat. And the chalice he used that you can see here was actually made from the driftwood of a refugee boat. So this actually was a very curious choice by Pope Francis to use this chalice. And the question came for me is, what does it mean to use a chalice at Mass, at a liturgy, at a worship service that's actually made from the driftwood of a refugee boat? And as I did that research, I actually went down to Lampedusa and I worked with the carpenter who made that chalice and spent a long time talking with him about the significance of this chalice. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that today, and I'd like to do it within the context of a theological perspective on migration. And when we think about migration from a theological perspective, what do we really mean? And I would just say that as just a basic kind of orientation on this, the first is we speak about it in terms of a pastoral level, namely how those who have resources or those who are concerned or care reach out to migrants on the move through direct service, through material aid, and through legislative advocacy. It's an important part of a theology of migration, but it's not the only part. The second part is much more of a listening posture. It's really a spiritual listening. And that's saying, what happens on the inside with migrants and refugees? What do they think and what do they feel? What would they say if they were speaking tonight? And so a lot of my research reflections come from research working around borders in different parts of the world, trying to listen to the stories of migrants and what they're going through on their inner journey. And then all of this comes together into the theological level. And that is, how does migration name something about what it means to be human before God? And how does that shape our own sense of identity? And especially because identity runs through so much of the issue of migration, I think it's important to look at how it can help us reframe even some of the narratives and the ways we think about migration today. So all of this is really what a theology of migration is about. And I'll get into this in a little more detail. But the main thing is I really only have three points I want to talk about. And then afterwards, I know Matt and our Sean will open up a discussion, and we'll have more broader conversations with the larger group here. But the 3 points I want to look at is first to look at the global refugee crisis, some of the numbers, the statistics, the people moving around the world. It's not a new issue, as I said, but the scale and the scope and the magnitude of it is greater than ever before. The second thing I want to look at is what Pope Francis called the globalization of indifference, and particularly in light of his trip to Lampedusa and something of what that means. I want to look at some of the ways in which people think about migrants and refugees and different perspectives on this. So I think this would be helpful to kind of frame some of this as well. The third and last piece I want to look at is really what John Paul II talked about, but Francis really has reiterated. It's really about a globalization of solidarity. If globalization is to happen, how do we make it so that it does bring us together more as human beings rather than drive us further apart and make us more alien, if you will? So those are the three things I'd like to get in today. So the first part I'd like to get in is just simply looking at a 30,000-foot view of what's happening with migrants and refugees today. First is that there are more migrants than at any other point in history, more international migrants, and that is people who are living away from their homeland because of various reasons. And not every one of those living around the world and away from their homeland is a vulnerable migrant, or their lives are not always in jeopardy. But the scale of people moving across borders is greater than ever before. Right now, there's more than 272 million international migrants around the world, people living for more than a year outside of the place where they were born. That means 1 out of every 35 people in the world is a migrant. But of that population, 80 million are refugees. That's more refugees than even we had after World War II. So the scale of vulnerability, the amount of people whose lives are in jeopardy, who are really suffering under tremendous duress, either in danger of physical torture or their lives themselves being at risk, is greater than any other point in human history. If we were to take this even further, if we were to settle refugees in one particular place, they would be the 21st largest country in the world. And they would be growing at a rate of 38,000 people a day, or 24 people per minute. Another way of really saying that is that if we count all those moving within countries, as well as those crossing borders, there's as many as 1 billion migrants on the world and around the world today, which is 1 out of every 7 people in the world. So in many ways, it's been referred to our own times as the age of migration. And these numbers are only going to get worse, especially as we look at climate change, we look at inequalities of wealth, we look at political instabilities. All of this is going to create even more uprooting and people moving. That's going to highlight even more of the tension. So this issue is not going to go away. Really, no matter how big the walls are that we build, and which I will say here many times, is that migration is not really the central problem. Migration is a symptom of far deeper problems that precipitated in the first place. So, but behind these numbers are people. These are not just statistics. And I remember 2 times that I saw the Pietà and really was moved to tears. And the first time was when I saw the carving of the Pietà Michelangelo's in Rome. And but the second was when I saw it carved out a living experience. And this was a picture taken from near the Syrian border. We were on a delegation looking at the Syrian crisis, especially right after ISIS and after the conflicts had started. And this woman had already lost 3 sons. Her 4th son was just put in prison. Her grandson had just been killed. They were living out in tents in the middle of this field right at the Lebanon border. Some of the people still had bullets in them. And they had not had any medical attention. And these women here just had lost their husbands, the ones on the right. And it was just striking to me how powerful a moment this was to see this woman literally holding in her hands the death of her children, not having any words, even her friend to the left, just not having words to be able to touch that pain either. No words could possibly reach it. But this is really a human face of migrants today and of refugees. And I think behind these numbers are very real people. And I hope that if you take nothing away from this time together, it's really to really highlight the human face of the migrant, because this is not just about theological ideas. Ultimately, it's about people and it's about life. So, it's a complicated issue at the same time. And what I want to say here is that migration is an incredibly, incredibly complex and difficult issue. And at the same time, I'd like to say that migration is an incredibly, incredibly simple issue. And both of those are true at the same time. And what I mean by that is I remember some time ago, I was doing some work down on the southern border, and I was working with the Border Patrol. And I'd been working with them in various contexts, in their search and rescue missions, on their ride-alongs, and their helicopter surveillance. And at one point, one of the Border Patrol agents, as we were down the southern border, we were kind of driving right along the wall. One of them said to me, he said, one time I was down here, and actually I saw these are his words. He says, I saw some aliens, they were getting out of this truck. And he said, normally 98% of these people are hardworking people looking for a job. He says, but in this particular occasion, they were smuggling drugs. And he says, when I went in pursuit of them, they turned around and they started raining machine gun fire upon me. And he says, I hit the deck. And he says, I saw these bullets and I could hear them whizzing over my head. And he thought I was going to die right at that moment. But as he went on to say, he says, it was so traumatizing that he had to go to counseling, that it really affected his marriage, and he'd wake up with nightmares. And it suddenly dawned on me that this guy, really was putting his life on the line every day. But sometime later that day, as we were driving along, he arrested a group of migrants. And as he was running out of the truck in search of them, I felt this tremendous conflict within me, because I'd heard the stories of people who were migrating, and he himself was doing his job. And I felt the tensions of all of these things together. And I realized that, to be fair to this issue, you have to understand very different perspectives, even different perspective from one position one may hold. So it led to doing some research on the border and listening to different attitudes and perspectives. And this is the fruit of years of research, but what I'd like to do is share with you some of these perspectives and some of the values that are underneath them, to just give a little bit of a context about migration in both its simplicity and its complexity. It's simple in that it deals with human life. It's complex in the sense that there are many positions that really surround it as well, all of which have a position and a point to make. The different groups involved are range from the vigilante groups, and what I'd like to present here is the most positive side of what they're trying to do here. And I'll go through this quickly, precisely so we can have some time to talk. But vigilantes are really trying to protect personal property along the border. They're often concerned citizens who want to prevent unlawful entry, and they want to fill in gaps where federal enforcement fails. There are also people from the Department of Homeland Security or ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, whose job it is to enforce policy. They want to ensure order and prevent unlawful entry, especially of people who come across without documents and could harm its citizens. So they don't make the laws, but their job is to enforce the laws. The political leaders are trusted with making federal policy. Their job is to protect the citizens of a country and to manage its resources. In the early days of the country, we let in almost everybody, but we did actually turn people away for various reasons at Ellis Island and other places, if people had diseases or if they were anarchists or other things. So then we let in almost everybody, but we did make some exceptions. Now we let in almost nobody, but we make some exceptions. So the policy changes a lot over time, and so have the borders. Corporations as well have tried to hire cheap labor or talented labor to maximize profits and sell products at the lowest cost. We see corporations involved in this much more in trying to get workers, either skilled workers or labor, in order to sell their products or develop them or become globally competitive. Church leaders as well have been very vocal on this. And I think at heart, church leaders are trying to proclaim a God of life, to protect the rights of human beings who are made in God's image and likeness. And Pope Paul VI said, really, the mission of the church is to build a civilization of love. That is, it's to denounce injustice and to announce the reign of God. And lastly, human rights advocates, what they're trying to do is to protect the rights of immigrants, to protect prevent the exploitation of the vulnerable, and to fight for human dignity. So there's a lot of overlap there, but in some sense, they draw from different sources of inspiration. So in this sense, this is not a matter of good people and bad people. This is around people kind of trying to pursue various goods. But if that's the case, why is it so contentious? Well, as we started doing more research on this, we realized that underneath these positions, there are certain rights at stake that people are really trying to advance. This group here is really trying to protect property rights. This group here is often looking at sovereign rights, namely the right of a nation to protect its borders. This group here is often looking at cultural rights, namely, in this sense, determining what it means to be an American. This group here is really fighting for economic rights and making the economy and the opportunities free, open, and fair. This group here is looking at natural rights, namely those given by God. And this group here is looking at human rights, classically defined. So if to make it even more complex, if everyone's fighting for rights, why does it seem to go so wrong in so many different ways? This really boils down to three political positions. This group basically has closed the borders and really invest in enforcement, put more people on the borders, build higher walls. This has been the policy, actually, of our government for the last three decades. This group here is really looking at guest worker programs. During World War II, there was a shortage of laborers. And so we did allow workers to come back and forth and to work here for periods of time and to return home. This is probably the only place where a brokered compromise could be made in having guest worker programs. This group here is fighting for more of the legalization of the earned to right, an earned path to citizenship, and the possibilities to legalization. It's more open borders. The Catholic Church doesn't affirm kind of completely open borders. It says there's a value to borders, but it doesn't see those rights to even control borders as absolute rights. So these are kind of different political positions, and we know there's a lot of controversy surrounding that. But where it really begins to shift, and this is one of the things I would like to emphasize tonight, is it's not just getting more information about migration, but also trying to look at the narratives that shape our positions about migration. What is the operative narrative that shapes how I see people who are migrating? Where does that narrative come from? And what's the language that really stitches together that narrative? So this first group is referred to often as aliens, and this is the official term that's used by the government. I believe the current administration has really proposed a change to this because it is actually a very dehumanizing word in many ways, because it really asks, are these people human or not? And that really is an important question. If a person crosses the border without legal documentation, what kind of rights do they have? Do they have no rights because they shouldn't be here legally, or do they have intrinsic rights? These are debated into the highest courts around the world. This group here sees them fundamentally as workers. And so here it's an economic calculus. And I'm not an economist, but economists who really study this in detail basically put this at parity. For every argument there is against undocumented workers taking something from a system, there's also evidence that they give a lot back too. They do work that no one else wants to. They pay taxes often and don't get anything back. So there are arguments made on both sides, but the net question here is, are they a net gain or drain on the economy? The next group are people. This is not a really deep thought, but it's probably the most important, because if we don't actually see them as people, then in some sense, there are other equations that really tilt this calculus in other ways. But if these are human beings made in God's image and likeness, that actually roots the moral gravitas of this in a very different way. So, but here's where theology can begin to really sort of make a difference here, because as we look at the legal question, more often than not, when I've given talks on this, people in some form or another with various levels of aggressiveness will say something akin to me like, Father, which part of illegal don't you understand? I mean, they broke the law, they shouldn't be here. What don't you get? And I think that in all fairness, the question and response, the response to that question is more, which part of the law don't you understand? Because law isn't just about what's on the books. law actually has to do with other things as well. And Thomas Aquinas said there are in fact 4 kinds of laws. There are civil laws by which a society organizes itself for the common good. There are natural laws by which people want to feed their families. There are divine laws, which we know through Scripture. And there are eternal laws through which God keeps the universe in motion. Martin Luther King Jr. said there has to be some kind of symmetry and connection between those laws, or else we have unjust laws like segregation, which really go against natural laws such as human dignity. So this group is going to argue for civil laws. It's an appeal to what I would call the invisible mind, which would go something like this. What, are you crazy? I mean, these people are going to take our jobs and they're going to ruin our cultures. I mean, they're going to even make us eat salsa all the time. And they're going to ruin this culture that we have. So there's an appeal to reason on some level to say that this is not good for us. But this next group really appeals to the economic laws. And there are arguments made for, bringing in immigrants because it actually is helpful to the economy. There's even some that say if you get rid of all the immigrants, it actually will make the economy go down by 20%. So the debate on this level becomes very much about what Adam Smith calls the invisible hand. That's a topic that would be worth discussing in more detail, but really there are kind of other things that are at stake and other laws really that are operative. This group here refers to really the natural laws and what the United Nations calls the invisible heart. And that's an interesting term from the United Nations because it's very rich theologically as well. And in both settings, the question is, how can we really look at the bigger frame about what our lives are about? And if it's about growing in community and growing together as a society, then it's a very different set of variables in this calculus. So all of this, though, comes down fundamentally to one question, and that is, who is the other? This is really at stake in racial issues, immigration issues, cultural issues, international issues, you name it. Who am I? Who is the other? And ultimately, who is God? And who are we before God? But how we calculate the immigrant otherness is really determines a lot about sort of where we go on this issue. This first group really looks at this in terms of a fear of the other. This second group will calculate in terms of the calculus of the other. And the third will look at it in terms of a connection to the other. So here's where the deeper migrations, I think, more challenging migrations need to happen, is moving in between these spaces, in between these quadrants. Not just asserting my opinion over another person's, but also trying to understand the position, even of people who are different, but also asking ourselves where we are and what kind of walls we have in between these positions. So to summarize this part, really, I think this is not just something that's happening at geographical borders or political borders. It's something that's also happening at conceptual borders. And those borders might be summarized as saying it's a tension between sovereign rights and human rights. That is a tension between the right of a nation to control borders, but also the right of people to a dignified life and even to migrate if necessary. Secondly, it's a tension between civil law and natural law. That is, a nation has a right to organize a system of regulations for the common good. But people, if they're hungry or thirsty, or if they're tortured, or if their lives are at risk, have a right to provide for their families and to feed and educate and shelter them. Thirdly, it's a tension between national security and human insecurity. Really, in many ways, if we don't actually deal with the human insecurity outside our borders, arguably we will not have any security inside our borders. So how does a nation protect its inhabitants from harm and violence, especially from the outside? But how do people protect their families from undue need, hunger, and excessive poverty and vulnerability? And ultimately, that brings us to a tension between citizenship and discipleship. And that is really what's the tension and the duties of being a member of the state, but also saying that for those who really explicitly profess faith, how in this case, which I know best is Christian faith, how Christian faith calls for a much more inclusive mindset, which is about building bridges and crossing borders rather than just building walls and keeping people out. These are very difficult tension zones. Spirituality has lived in these tension zones. This is not an either or, but there are ways in which the values go deeper on different sides of this equation. So I want to come back again to this this image again that I showed in the beginning of this boat coming out of North Africa, and really Pope Francis's response. So there are thousands and thousands that die each year crossing over the Mediterranean like this, and in other parts of the world. And this one place here wasn't Lampedusa. So this is just no more than a rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's only about 6 square miles. This on the left is their version of the Statue of Liberty. And this is really the hope that people coming from Africa can actually land on European shores. So if you're coming out of Africa and you could land on this little piece of rock, you can actually try to declare asylum on these areas. And interestingly enough, this boat on the right here was a boat that actually was making its way to Italy, and outside of Lampedusa, it was intercepted by the Coast Guard and escorted towards the Lampedusa harbor. But as they got closer to the shore, the rudder broke and it began drifting perilously to the rocks. And they summoned the villagers in the middle of the night. And these same villagers had rescued hundreds and hundreds of bodies that floated up on their shores from these shipwrecks. But this time, they rescued everybody that they had on this boat. And it was about 528 people. So this boat became a symbol of salvation, if you will. And many of these boats end up in a boat graveyard here in Lampedusa. And this was the carpenter who actually prepared for the Pope's visit. You can see in the back some of his crosses. He said he was very depressed because he used to, pull these bodies out of the water. And then, finally he began to just say, how do I recognize that these were people, that they had value, and that that their life really is important to God and really should be important to us. And so he began making these crosses out of the driftwood of these boats you can see in the background there. But this boat in particular that I just told a story about, really, he came back one day and just looked at this boat and he said, finally, we saved somebody. But when they, a couple of days later, the boat broke apart, and they found a couple of bodies underneath the hull of people who had died. So what was a symbol of life then became a symbol of death. But the wood from this boat became very important for him. And he took the driftwood of this, and eventually what he did was he started making chalices because he wanted to tell the story of the lives of these people, both those that had been saved and those that had died. And in that, this chalice was used at the Mass that the Pope celebrated in Lampedusa. Here you can see the crozier that he made that's in the form of a ship's wave. It has fish on there. It has a heart. It has a loaf of bread. But they took the elements of the story of that island and the story of the refugee crisis and then brought it into the larger narrative, the faith narrative of Jesus, of his disciples that also knew the experience of being on boats, and really tried to ask, how do we think about God from the perspective of the refugee crisis? And so the central idea that I'd like to propose is this, and this is really the central idea, hopefully that you'll take through this talk today, is that God and Jesus Christ so loved the world that he migrated from his homeland into the far and distant territory of our sinful and broken existence. And there he reconciled himself with us on the cross so that we could migrate back to our homeland. And so what we see God doing in Jesus is breaking down walls and borders and barriers of every sort that keep us alienated from God and from one another. In other words, God came to save illegal aliens. That's really the angst of Paul. That's really the message of the gospel. And that's really the substance of the Eucharist, is moving from otherness in our alien status to communion, to oneness, from otherness to oneness. And this is the pulpit that they used at the Mass. This is made from the oars of the, if you will, or the rudders of some of these boats. And this was finally the chalice that he used. And interestingly enough, he said that when he was making the chalice, he had to take out this nail to basically sculpt the bottom, the base part. And he said when he took it out, he said the holes in the chalice were very evocative of the holes of Christ's hand and Christ's hands. But he said when he put the nail back into the chalice, he says it made the form of a cross. So on top of the cross sits the chalice of life. And if you want to read more about this, I've written an article called Cup of Suffering, Chalice of Salvation, which is on immigration and the Eucharist. So the book that I'm trying to finish is really about migration and Eucharist, but the whole gist of it is to try to look at this really divine imperative to move from otherness to oneness. That's really what the Eucharist is about, and really ultimately that's what Christian faith is about. But it looked at in terms of the migrant crisis, it's really about seeing our interconnection to each other rather than trying to separate it and build walls against it. So just to kind of wrap up and summarize this, ultimately this faith-based vision is about passing over. I mean, the Catholic Mass is built on the Jewish Seder meal, which is about really remembering the events of the Exodus, which is a migration story, which is a liberation story, which is ultimately about passing over from death to life. But it's also about passing over a country-kingdom divide and saying that there's some relative value into understanding that I've identified by my nationality. But ultimately, from a faith-based perspective, Jesus isn't interested in flag waving. He's interested ultimately in the kingdom of God. And that kingdom, as Vatican II says, is a kingdom of truth and life, of holiness and grace, of justice, of love, and of peace. And what that means really ultimately is that that God is migrating into our world to save a broken humanity, to lead it back home, but to also help it find its way back to connection with one another. So what I've tried to do tonight is really to share some reflection about the journey of those who are considered as quote unquote nobodies, that they really often are even unacknowledged. The carpenter who made this chalice said that he said at the same time that bodies were rolling up on his shores, there was an earthquake in Italy. And while the ones who died in the earthquake were given a public funeral and there was a national day of mourning, he said those who died on the shores, they weren't even recognized. They were like nobody to anybody. And so many migrants today are invisible and they die even without people knowing it. So this journey of the nobodies is really what Pope Francis speaks about when he talks about the globalization of indifference. He says, if they mean nothing to me and they are literally nobody, then something has also died in me. Secondly, it's their struggle to become somebody. Often what they want is just to live a dignified life and to be recognized as human beings. Many say they don't want to just become rich, they just want to become human. And in many ways, the migration to different places is about that struggle to become human. Thirdly, it's to highlight their relationship to everybody. That in some sense, it's not just us and them, it's really about all of us. And I think it's a deep awakening spiritually and existentially when we see those interconnections. And, lastly, that all of this is connected to the body of Christ. This is each year they have a mass at the border, which you might call an American Lampedusa. This is Bishop Kirkanis from Arizona, but this is the border wall. So they have a binational mass each year. Half the communities in Mexico, half the communities in the United States, half the bishops are in Mexico, half the bishops are in the United States. They join the altar together at the fence. And then at the communion, you have one Eucharist amidst this divided political reality. And I think by doing this, it really is a way of saying that the church already sees this union as taking place. And the Eucharist really makes that very public. And that these walls too will fall down. And the reason why Christ claims ultimately is to break down the walls that divide us. That goes all through Paul's letters. But here we see Bishop Kirkanis giving the Eucharist through the fence to someone in Mexico from the United States saying, yes, we are one, in fact. So as we've looked at the global refugee crisis, we've looked at the globalization of indifference, finally, we really come to say that this is about globalizing solidarity and seeing our interconnections. Hopefully, it's a way of really stimulating a new imagination about migration or scripting a new narrative about migration. And what might that look like? The Department of Homeland Security is what controls a lot of our border kind of affairs in the United States. But maybe there's a new way of conceiving that instead of just looking at that in terms of enforcement, we'd see first that border reform and comprehensive border reform is really about development. That ideally people can stay in their homelands, and that for them to stay in their homelands and not have to migrate, a development is necessary. But while we work at that, we recognize that one of the hallmarks really of Christian faith is hospitality, of learning how to welcome the stranger, welcome the most vulnerable, and especially welcoming the least and the last. All that's a way of seeing our interconnections in solidarity. So I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more to say, a lot more on this topic I'd like to really speak about, but I think it's better that we just have a discussion. So Matt and Sean, I'm going to turn it back to you, and we'll go from there.
All right. Thank you. And Tara, if you could turn I think my video was turned off. So I'm not sure if I'm able to turn that back on, or if we should just leave Father Grudy's video on. It's fine to me either way. But thank you, Father Grudy, for that talk. And again, here's where the virtual applause would come in. And so we can pause for a moment of silence to hear the applause, I suppose. No, but anyhow, thank you very much. So that was there was a lot there, and I guess what I would like, if I could, I would like to start the conversation with just by asking you. You talked a lot about seeing the migrant and how we think of them as the other, and really the words we use matter. If we describe them as an alien versus as a person, I mean, just even the basic words we use deeply matter. How we think about who they are. And what I would really like to begin with, though, is if you would to inform the audience a bit more about the chalice. That was that's a fascinating image to me. But I'm not sure that everybody here sort of knows the kind of ritual and theological significance of what the use of that chalice made out of that boat would mean. So, for example, what the Catholic view on communion and the Eucharist is in terms of Christ's presence and all of that, and what that might symbolize for how we come to see who the other is. Do you understand my sort of initial question?
Yeah, so the chalice is used at Mass. It's used at the Eucharist. The Eucharist is a worship service, and there's two parts of it. One, first part of it, if you will, the scriptures are read, and if you will, the congregation feeds from the scriptures. And the second part is the sacrament, and it feeds from the body of Christ, the body and blood of Christ. And so it's the Lord's Supper. It's a way of remembering what Christ did with his disciples at the last Passover meal that he celebrated with his disciples. It's a memorial, it's a sacrifice, and it's a ritual that celebrates the liberation from bondage in Egypt to freedom and promise, and the promise of eternal life and forgiveness of sins. There's many dimensions to it. But it's also a chance where the church recognizes Christ's presence in the scriptures, recognizes it in the gathered community, recognizes it in the person of the priest, but also recognizes it in the sacramental elements. That it believes that somehow that this body and blood, or this wine and this bread doesn't just remain bread and wine, that it changes, it transforms, it becomes something different, it becomes something special. It becomes really the presence of Christ as well. So the Catholics speak about the real presence of Christ. Some other Christian communities do. Some of that is debated in different ways by different communities, how present that is. But what's also important to hear is that when one receives this Eucharist, one also is called to become it. So the real presence of Christ is something that people are called not just to see out there, but also to be in here. So that process of transformation, of becoming another Christ and becoming transformed by what one receives, that's what amen means. When I receive it, I say amen, which is yes, may I become what I receive. Now, what's remarkable about this is that the altar is a borderlands of its own. It's a place where heaven and earth meet. The entrance into the Mass is really a way of ritualizing the fact that our life is a pilgrimage. And it's a pilgrimage that goes up until our own death. And that's what the altar symbolizes. So when you use a chalice that holds the body and the blood of Christ, that Christ asked his disciples, can you drink from this cup of suffering? This chalice made from the refugee boat actually holds the suffering of humanity, but it also holds within it the promise of Christ's return journey home, that this suffering is not the last word, but that Christ transforms even this into himself in our return journey to him. So there's a lot there. Again, it goes into the article, it's a lot more, but also what I want to say is that whatever we say about real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, what I would also say is that his presence is also made real when these people are made real. So it's trying to make these invisible people real as well. That's another way to speak about real presence, is saying that there's a real presence of Christ in the species of the Eucharist itself, but there's also a real presence in these people who become invisible. And that's a piece of the Eucharist that probably people don't see at all.
Good. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to make sure that people sort of understood at least the basics of what that theology of the sacraments and the Eucharist is within the Catholic Church, because it really is such a powerful symbol that was used there. So thank you for that. Another question that sort of came to me as I was listening to this was, it's important to sort of see the refugee as a person. Can you give us examples of stories or ways in which we can make the refugee into a person, especially when you presented us with those very stark numbers early on? I sort of noted some of these things down. There were 272 million migrants, 80 million refugees. I mean, the problem is so vast that even within the United States, I remember we've been living through the pandemic, and I remember hearing some people it was either the field of sociology or somewhere, like, talking about the way in which humans, or it might even been psychology, grieve. And once you get past a certain number, it's just very difficult to put a face on, after you reach 200,000 deaths, 500,000 deaths, the suffering becomes so unimaginable that it's almost dehumanizing in and of itself. But at the same time, you talk about the importance of putting a human face on it. How, the chalice is one way. How else do we do that? How do we see these people as people when the problem is so vast?
They're everywhere if we stop and look. And they're working in our offices. They're kind of picking fruits in the fields. They're often working in landscaping, construction. And I think just asking people their stories, which is where a lot of my research has been about, is just, having people tell their stories. And this is one, I just to share just another one, that I was giving a talk in New Hampshire one time, and I was speaking about the refugee crisis. I mentioned Rwanda very briefly. Rwanda is a place, as we know, that 1 million people died in 100 days because of really an all-out tribal war between Hutus and Tutsis. But I just mentioned it in passing, but afterwards a woman came up to me and told me she was from Rwanda. And I asked her to stay in contact, and she called me 2 weeks later, and she asked me to work with her on the search for God from the context of genocide. She lost over 100 people in her own family, and she and her husband narrowly escaped death. So we began an 8-year-long project, and we went down to Rwanda, and we spent a lot of time going to the places where a lot of the family members were killed. But it was to walk with them on the search for God from the context of genocide was very powerful. I knew from the beginning I didn't know how to speak about God from that context, but listening to them and walking with them was very powerful. And I think walking with migrants and listening to their stories and reverencing their stories is very important. And most of the times I'd have to say that when I asked them, what's the hardest part? One of them said, he said, the worst part's when you're just treated like you're a dog, like you're the lowest form of life on earth, and like you're no one to anyone. They said, all we want to be is a human being. And so at the common root of all migrants I've talked to is this undeconstructible side that says, I just want to be a human being.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it's tragic that they're asking for so little, and yet it seems to be so hard to give them even that basic right. Now, are there any stories that one of the other things I was thinking about as I was listening to you is, what sorts of stories that might you have that you could share with us where it really came home to you, the human face on this? You've traveled, it sounds like, a lot of different contexts, a lot of different places. Are there any stories that sort of stand out to you where you really began to see people differently, and maybe even to see yourself differently in this? Because I think a lot of this is sort of how we think about the other, who the other is, but I have a feeling that also leads to kind of self-transformation too. Are there any stories in particular that you'd be willing to share with us where you sort of had, where that process really hit home for you?
Yeah, Matt, I wish I had more time to really draw those out, but really living out of those stories are very important to me. A couple that come to mind, I remember, one time I was down in southern Arizona, and this guy was walking across the desert for a number of days. And, when I stopped by to pick him up, he was holding water jugs in his hands, and so he looked at me and he says, like, I just want to turn myself into the Border Patrol. And I said, so I said, listen, just why don't you hop in? And so along the way, I said, what's it like out there? And he says, I was with some friends, and he said, I was walking with them, and he says, I couldn't keep up. And he says, they left me behind. And he says, I got disoriented. I couldn't find my way. And then he said, and I said, he didn't know who I was. And so I said, well, what did you do? He says, I prayed to God. He said, because I knew God was the one friend that would stay with me after everybody else left me. And I said, well, were there any passages, of scripture that occurred to you? And he says, yes. He says, I thought about Job. He says, he lost his country, he lost his health, he lost his friends. He says, but he never cursed God. And he said, that's who I want to be. And I think one of the things what struck me was, like, where I expected people to be depressed and angry, I found them generous and kind and thoughtful. And there's another story in Arizona where there was a group of humanitarians that were bringing water out and food out to people in the desert. And at one point, there was a group coming towards them, and they screamed from a distance, and they said, do you have any water? And then they got all disoriented, and they realized people had seen them. And so then they said, do you have any food? And they went back and forth. So these humanitarian workers were calling this out to these migrants. And then at one point they stopped and they huddled together. And then one of them came forward and he says, look, we don't have much water and we don't have much food, but what we have, we'll share with you, And I think that kind of generosity and thoughtfulness, I could share so many other stories about people's unbelievable trust in God, faith, and care for each other amidst such difficulties, was inspiring. So where I expected to be the most godless of circumstances, surprisingly, I found it's a place where I found God very much alive.
Very interesting. Good. What you there? I mean, there are a lot of issues that I could touch on here. I guess another question that comes to my mind here is, what sort of advice would you have for those who are in either a Christian or non-Christian context who want to help out? What can we be doing? What should we be doing given the scope of the crisis? What sorts of actions should we be taking?
Yeah, again, I think the first is, first of all, I think there's a number of different ways to respond. One is direct service. So I think there are different ways people can be helped in terms of material needs, legislative advocacy, and support. The second is also legislative advocacy. I think people often work to change legislation that discriminate against migrants and refugees. Even just one example, Biden just changed the executive orders to 125,000 refugees that were allowing, that had been dropped to 15,000 during the last administration. And to put that in context, there are, of those 80 million refugees in the world, only 1% of the people that apply for refugee status actually get it. Only 1%. So of 100 people, only one get it. So these are the most threatened people really on the planet. And I think we were actually turning back that many people before. These aren't just undocumented immigrants crossing the border. These are people with certifiable threats. So I think changing laws that are more humane, I think is very important, but also education. And I would say, so direct service, advocacy, education, this is important, is really being reflective about our narratives, how we think about migration, how we think about our own histories about being migrants. Even in the scriptures, before they get to the promised land, they're constantly called to remember where they came from. Why? Probably because they forgot. And we often forget. And so the scriptures remind us, don't forget where you come from, because this could be you and this has been you. So I think memory can play the function of helping us be more compassionate, and really kind of helping respond in a much more humane and compassionate way.
Yeah, thank you. It was interesting because you opened up your talk by sort of showing us your own migration pattern, your family's migration pattern. I don't remember how far you went back. Was it 80 million years? I can't remember how far.
80,000 years, yeah.
80,000 years, sorry, not 80 million, just 80,000 years. And then you sort of went from there, showed us that family or that lineage, to then talking about scripture. And I guess one of my next questions to you is, what kind of there are various kinds of meditative processes. I know before we were talking about before this meeting, I was asking you who some of the major influential thinkers in the background of your thought, and you mentioned Ignatius of Loyola as being one of them. And of course, Loyola has some very famous spiritual exercises that he asks people to go through. I guess I was kind of wondering, is there a type of spiritual exercise? Are there types of practices that we can do that might allow us to come to think about immigration differently? Are there types of biblical passages that we can go to? Are there things that we can do so that we can kind of train ourselves to think differently about other people, in a positive and a constructive way? Are there spiritual practices?
For me, it was really a culture of encounter. Pope Francis has said this again and again, of really encountering, others. I mean, I didn't get into this from some even ideological or even kind of academic way. I really got into it through my experiences with people. And I really fell in love with Latin America. I fell in love with the people that I met there. And then later, I experienced people in the parishes I worked in who were migrants. And actually, I was interested in spirituality. And but when I really started studying the spirituality of Latinos, many of them were migrants. And that's how these kind of began to speak to each other. So what can we do? I think meet people who are different, meet people from other places, ask them to tell their stories, have a meal with them, ask them, what they've gone through. It's amazing, even here where I work. I mean, whether it's in the restaurants or the dining halls or the janitors, they are everywhere. And I think there's just unbelievable stories that people have lived through. And they're fascinating stories, and even stories of resilience and of determination and of faith and hope. And talk about courage, which you talked about in the beginning. My gosh, the courage that people have undertaken to really take these risks, to me, has been inspiring, and it touches your heart. And I think from that, it's led me to reflect on those stories, and that's kind of what I tried to do in my writings and films. You mentioned the films earlier. I think it's important to say that I also knew that the written word can only go so far, and that the visual word, namely multimedia, was also needed to reshape, I think, some of the ways we think about that. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity in imagination to do that. Someone once said, Edgar Greeley once said that one of the best theologians out there is Bruce Springsteen. So we actually contacted Bruce Springsteen, who gave us the music for one of those films. And he captures the migrant spirit beautifully. And, I think we have to look at ways of really maybe reshaping our visual and emotional and spiritual landscape than the stuff that gets programmed into us by society and by mainstream media.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. As I'm looking through my notes, another thing that I would actually like to ask you just to go through for the audience a bit more, as we think about how to think about the other in a more constructive way. You drew on various theological resources to do so, and terms. And some of them that you went back to on multiple occasions were notions of natural law and notions of the divine image, as ways in which, for those with a religious background or those interested in that, can help to reshape. Can you take the audience through a bit more about how those concepts function in a religious context and might be used to help reshape the way we see, especially immigrants or just other people?
Yeah, so that natural law comes, from Thomas Aquinas, and I think this blending of philosophy and theology. So the search for truth and the search for God going together hand in hand. But I think trying to give an account for reality and trying to have a reasonable understanding of what the faith is about, and the sense that this is compatible with reason, and that we can use our minds to understand these things, and that we draw on different sources, including the scriptures. But to really understand this, we have to use our whole self, or whole mind, or whole heart, or whole soul to really grasp this. And that's why I think what we see going on today is a very reductive account of immigration or of law or of other things. And so I think what I think Aquinas does is opens up the vice grips a bit more to say it's not enough to say you broke the law and case closed. I mean, that just reality demands more than that. Truth demands more than that. I think justice demands more than that. And I think some of these thinkers, I think, give us ways of maybe having a more comprehensive understanding of reality, which hopefully is freeing. I mean, it should be freeing in the sense that it registers as true. But I think it's also important as a frame to maybe look at other issues as well, because injustice can be made legal. I mean, there are laws on the books that are fundamentally illegal. So just because it's legal doesn't mean it's just, and just because it's illegal doesn't mean that it's not moral. And I think it takes some sophistication to actually do that and to look at that. But I think reality in life demands that. God demands that, I think, of us. So I think we have to move beyond sort of our easy answers. And it may be convenient, but it's not enough. And I think we have to allow ourselves to move, even migrate out of our own comfort zones, if you will, to really get a bigger perspective.
Matt, if I could, we have several questions here from the audience that I'd like to ask.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
Sure.
I'll start with one that I think sort of pivots away from some of the things you were just speaking about, Reverend Grudy, about that seem to be focused on how can I sort of change my view of the immigrant. This is Jen Latham, so my wife actually, who asks, how can we work to address and lessen the rage directed toward immigrants to the U.S. by members of our own community? That is, what kind of role can we play as advocates to try to change other people's minds? I suspect a lot of people in this room are already in agreement with much of what you're saying. So what kind of strategies do you imagine to help those of us who want to engage in this kind of work of recognizing the sort of oneness of the immigrant with ourselves? How do we go about changing the mind of others who clearly don't feel that way and are fall to that sort of right side of or maybe the top quadrant of the circle that you described, that are much more eager to close down borders and not to necessarily see connections between, that might stretch across those walls and fences you've discussed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, it's a hard one to answer. Sometimes I've asked myself like I have a stack of hate mail that I get periodically, and I often wonder what's behind the vitriol. I mean, that people have. I mean, I don't get the worst of it. I mean, the bishops, that I do work with, when I look at some of their stuff, that you get this, even from religious people, very, very angry about this issue. And I have to ask, why does this issue make you so angry? I mean, what is this that ignites such rage? I don't know. I mean, I've often asked that question. I think perhaps some of it has to do with this touches upon issues of security, issues of safety, issues of my own sense of well-being, whatever that might be. But it might also disrupt my own narratives. And maybe if my narratives have been constructed too simply or too narrowly, maybe it's really good that they get disturbed and they get disrupted, because maybe that's the spirit at work, trying to invite us into something bigger. Bernard Lonergan once said there's two types of people in the world. There are those who need certainty, and there are those who seek understanding. I want to say that again because it's very interesting, is that, he said there are those who need certainty, like it absolutely has to be clear, and there are those who seek understanding. I'd say first thing is this is a very complex issue. Last thing I'd want you to come away with is this is just really is this a very simple issue. But it is a simple issue in terms of its human dimensions, but it's a very complex issue as you layer it out. But what do we do? I mean, in terms of that, I think we need to reflect on what's behind that anger. But I think you have to want to be a reflective person to do that. And that might be a harder challenge. Going into the migration, there was one time when I gave a talk in the Mayo Clinic, and I use an example, and that is when I was 8 years old, I actually found a pamphlet that said, did you know you could actually miss heaven by 18 inches? And it went on to say that the distance between the head and the heart in most people is only 18 inches. And I think it's often said that the more difficult migration is moving from the head to the heart and back again. I think that migration into the heart may be the more difficult migration. And I think actually the walls that we build inside us are maybe much more formidable than ones we build around us.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. In part, I mean, I've written several editorials in the local paper here, and the only time I get hate mail is if I write about issues related to immigration. That's always a hot button issue. That is the thing that sort of lights up my like people actually handwrite letters. Because this issue does touch off some kind of, as you said, some kind of angry response that I think just saying be more empathetic is not going to be sufficient. And so let me use that maybe to pivot to two questions here by David Olson. One much more sharply pointed than the other. And the first is a sort of broad one, which is from a theological faith perspective, what do you believe the US immigration policy should be? If you could sort of work a government policy from this faith-based position, what might it look like?
I'm asked this question a lot, and I would say, first of all, I'm not a politician, and my work is not policy. So I really think I have to say quite off the bat, I'm not. I'm a priest. I'm a theologian, and I do work with people on policy, and my work hopefully does inform policy. I think it's rooted in sort of the human questions and spiritual questions that I ask. In terms of how you work this stuff out on that, I don't feel like I'm able to say exactly what that would mean, but I would say that there could be some things that I would point to as broad contours of that. First is, that we work towards this issue of development. So the ideal thing is that people stay in their homelands, that they don't have to move at all. And secondly, that in those homelands development, there would be a chance to work, that they'd have safety, that they'd have protection. A lot of these people are fleeing these homes. They're not just leaving their homelands, they're fleeing these homelands because they're not safe. They're not protected by their governments or their police or others. So development is the first piece. The second is really guest worker programs. They need the work, we need the workers to create a legal system where people can move back and forth. That's a very important, piece of that as well. I think in terms of refugee policy, being able to resettle some of the most vulnerable people in the world, that's kind of a tradition we've had. But we've resettled more refugees than any other country in the world. And the US bishops have resettled more refugees than any other organization in the United States. So if you're just to take the work of the Bishops' Conference alone through Catholic Charities and member agencies, it'd be the second largest resettler of refugees in the world. So we work hand in hand with the government on that. We have a strong tradition of that. One of the best examples of where the government has policies on migration issues is on human trafficking. The Trafficking in Persons report gives a grade on all countries of how they deal with the issue of human trafficking. And the United States doesn't always give itself a very good grade itself on that. But it's really government at its best because it shows that government is meant to protect people and to really help people who are most vulnerable. What we can't do is take advantage of people and treat them as pawns or cogs in an economic machine and benefit from them, but also deprive them of their basic human rights or their abilities to be together. Lastly, there's something just on keeping families together. I mean, working in Mexico, in rural Mexico for many years, I often saw that men would migrate north to Mexico while women and children stayed home. This is changing, of course, but I think it's just not natural, and it's not something God wants, is to separate people like that, so that it isn't just a work-based visas, but it also family-based visas. So those are some broad contours that I would offer. But again, I think there are specialists who, in terms of brokering the policies, have more to say.
And I'm curious, in terms of your own approach, we often collapse two categories that you were careful to pull apart, which is the refugee and the migrant. And it seems to me your perspective here sort of tries to include both of them, but often we hear politicians in particular, I think now trying to draw a distinction between, well, there's just people who want to come here and there are people who are seeking shelter here. And it probably is useful or it may be useful for some to think about them as different groups. I wonder how this faith-based perspective might try to draw out that distinction, or is it a useful distinction to try to draw?
These distinctions are somewhat helpful. At some point they blend. I think, there's the economic migrant who's looking for work. There's the forced migrant who's really compelled to flee because their lives are in danger. There's the internally displaced person who's really uprooted within their homeland, say in like Syria or China or somewhere like that. And there's the victim of human trafficking as well. So some of those distinctions do make a very real difference in terms of legal protections that you would have. So if you cross a border and you say refugee, you're processed ideally differently. They weren't under the Trump administration, but ideally, and by our own previous accords, you basically have to see a judge. And if you can show that your life's in danger, you won't be sent back to your homeland. If you're an economic migrant, you cross the border and you don't have no legal rights to be here on that. So those distinctions are made. But by and large, most people never want to leave their homeland. And most people would never leave if they had the choice. So again, that's why I think we have to look at the reasons why people are migrating, not just the fact that they're migrating. But the distinctions do have some value, but I think labels have limits. And I think at some point those distinctions blend.
And David Olson asks a more pointed question here. That's his term exactly, actually. And I might put this slightly different. I'm gonna read his question. If the Christian view is one of otherness to oneness, how do you understand the Christianity of those who espouse an enforcement and economic perspective? And I guess a slightly gentler way of putting that might be, are there alternative theological approaches that might not be perhaps as generous as the one that you're described here, that might see this migration challenge and the migration story differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are different perspectives. I mean, but I offer a Eucharistic vision of that. I think it's important to see that there is a value in otherness too. I mean, I think from my earliest days when I lived in Uruguay as an exchange student, I was very captivated by difference in culture. And but I was always very drawn by unity in terms of our common human root, that whatever made us different also united us. Catholicism is a big tent. There's a lot of difference in Catholicism. And I think there are even different strands of thought within Catholicism and different tensions within those thoughts. I think we even have a tension between wanting a home, but having to move and wanting to move. I think that's part of our nature. So I think that it's important to recognize that there is a unity in a diversity, which is part of really what Catholics see. So a unity is not a uniformity. And nor would I say that other positions on this couldn't exist in tension that make a case for the value of borders. The church also kind of says there's a right of nations to control borders. But it also doesn't see that, again, as an absolute right. So I think you have to admit some tensions in these positions. At some point, I do make an argument here, and I think that's where people can take a different position than me on that. I'm not sure I understand the second part on the economics of that. Maybe you could clarify it.
Well, I think he was talking about the categories that you were using, and it's David's question, but I think he was just sort of asking about an alternative theological approach here that would favor borders, that would favor a more enforcement oriented. And does that make them less Christian somehow or less Catholic? At least that's how I'm reading this question.
Yeah. The economic exploitation. Well, I mean, that would be very clear. I mean, the economic exploitation of beings. No, I think the church would give primacy to human costs over economic costs, and that it would say, quite clearly that it'd be sinful to exploit other human beings. I don't think there's any variance really on that thought at all. So I think some of it is clear that I find that. But at stake, I think also, what does it mean to be Christian in the context of global poverty? Of 19% of the world lives on less than $1 a day, 48% lives on less than $2 a day, 75% lives on less than $10 a day. 95% of the world lives on less than $50 a day. When you look at the top 1% of the world has as much as the poorest 57% of the world. There are gross disorders here. And I think the question is, what does it mean to be Christian in the context of that disordered world? And how do we actually help reorder it again? I think that's part of the task.
Here's a different question from Karen Peterson, who's actually the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at TU. And she says, other than scale, does the refugee and migrant story of today differ from millennia of historical conflict over who can have access or be denied access to certain territories? And she then asks, are we simply experiencing the globalization of localized indifference that's persisted for a great long time?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gary. I mean, I think that's probably true. In some sense, we're probably seeing the same thing in a different key. I mean, it is about identities. I mean, is even the political challenges we have now like another chapter in tribal identities? I mean, I see this even here on campus. Like when you arrive on campus, no one knows who they are in the beginning, and then they get landed in the dorm, and then they, have to sort of figure out, okay, now I belong to this tribe at this dorm, and then within the dorm I have this section in this dorm. So the tribe begins to form very early in the identity formation. Until the first football game. Then the tribe changes. Then it's like, we are ND and then you are Oklahoma. So this is like the us and them begins to take on a new thing. So I think these issues of who the other is, this is an age-old issue, who the refugee is. I think, but if there's something to take away in the biblical story, it's not about us and them. It's about all of us. And it's not that just they're the migrants, we all are. And if we see that we're actually migrating back to a homeland and that we're all migrants in this world, that shifts the otherness to say we're in this together. So why not help each other along the way? I think that's, to me, what the scriptures are really trying to get through to us. And if you see Jesus, this is the other thing, is if you see Jesus as the illegal immigrant of God, or the the undocumented alien, if you will. This is one of my thesis, is that when God became human in Jesus, and if you will, when he entered into Mary's womb, Mary was already betrothed to someone, and it was illegal to be pregnant by somebody else. And so Jesus is illegal from his birth, and he really is an alien because he's from another world. So, I mean, in that sense, the good news begins with an illegal alien. That should disrupt our consciousness. I mean, that should get us to rethink who the other is, especially when the illegal alien is the one who saves us.
Well, I think that's a really powerful way to perhaps end the evening. So I want to thank you, Reverend Grudy. Matt, I really want to thank you for bringing this program to us and for so ably leading us through the conversation this evening.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sean, for hosting this, and thank you, Father Grudy. This was a wonderful talk. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Great being with you, everybody.
I wish we could bring you to Tulsa, and perhaps that opportunity will present itself again in the future. But in the meantime, let me say once again how grateful we are for you joining us and for sharing your thoughts with us. And of course, we're grateful to all of you who joined us at the center this evening for what I hope was a provocative and I hope action-oriented conversation about where we can go from here when thinking about the refugee crisis we all face. So thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.